Why would one of the most powerful jobs in the NFL suddenly become the one nobody wants? On paper, the Cleveland Browns head coaching role should be a dream. Full control, a young quarterback, and a franchise desperate to win. But behind closed doors, this job is quietly turning into a career landmine. And at the center of it all is Shedeur Sanders. What's happening right now isn't a normal coaching carousel. It's not just about X's and O's, playbooks, or rebuilding timelines. This is about power, perception, and fear. Multiple reports suggest elite coaching candidates are hesitating or outright refusing to touch the Browns' job. Not because they doubt football itself, but because of everything that comes with it. The noise, the spotlight, the expectations, and the reality that this isn't a clean slate, it's a test. The Browns aren't simply asking, "Can you coach this team?" They're asking something far more dangerous. Can you win with Shedeur Sanders as QB1? No escape clauses, no quarterback reset, no excuses. And for a league obsessed with protecting reputations, that question is enough to scare people off. This situation exposes a side of the NFL most fans never see. Coaches who preach toughness suddenly choosing safety. Analysts calling for leaders of men while quietly lowering expectations. And a young quarterback being turned into a symbol for everything people claim is wrong with modern football before he's even been given a real chance. And that's the part that should make everyone pause. Because this isn't really about the Browns. It's not even just about Shedeur. It's about what happens when opportunity meets insecurity, and who's actually brave enough to step forward when the pressure isn't optional. The Cleveland Browns head coaching vacancy should not be radioactive, but somehow it is. Around the league, insiders are quietly saying the same thing. This is the worst opening in football right now. Not because of the city, not because of the fan base, but because the situation forces a level of accountability most coaches don't actually want. At the center of it is the Browns themselves, a franchise with decades of instability, constant resets, and a reputation that never fully goes away. Coaches know the history. They know how fast patience runs out in Cleveland. And they know that when things go wrong, the blame rarely stops at ownership. It rolls downhill. But this time, there's an added layer that changes everything. Cleveland isn't offering a blank canvas. They're offering a condition. Whoever takes this job is expected to build around Shedeur Sanders, not compete him, not quietly replace him, build around him. That's the non-negotiable part being discussed behind closed doors, and that's where candidates start getting uncomfortable. The Browns are still financially tied to Deshaun Watson. They spent major draft capital on Dylan Gabriel. The front office isn't aligned. Ownership has made public comments that raised eyebrows, and the general manager is already sitting on a hot seat. That's not a rebuild, that's a pressure cooker. Coaches understand what this means in real terms. If Shedeur succeeds, the credit won't fully be theirs. The story becomes about talent, hype, and inevitability. But if he struggles, the coach becomes the shield, the explanation, the first one blamed. That asymmetry is terrifying in a league where second chances are rare. That's why this job feels different from the outside versus the inside. Fans see opportunity. Coaches see risk. They see a roster with conflicting timelines, a media spotlight that never dims, and an owner whose expectations may not match reality. And unlike other openings, there's no easy reset button here. This isn't a place to quietly install your system and buy time. It's a place where every decision will be magnified, every press conference dissected, and every loss attached directly to your belief in one quarterback. And for many coaches, that's exactly why they're hesitating. But the story doesn't stop at fear, because the next question is even more uncomfortable. What does it say about the league when so many elite coaches won't take on a challenge like this? What's making this coaching search truly unprecedented isn't the Browns' dysfunction. It's the ultimatum attached to the job. This isn't a normal interview process where candidates walk in, evaluate the roster, and pitch their own vision. This time, The vision is already partially decided. Before schemes, before staff hires, before culture talk, one question comes first. Are you willing to commit to Shedeur Sanders as QB1? That changes everything. Behind closed doors, this isn't being framed as an option. It's being framed as a condition. The Browns aren't asking coaches whether they like Shedeur. They're asking whether they're willing to stake their reputation on developing him. That's a massive leap of faith in a league where coaches survive by minimizing uncertainty, not embracing it. For many candidates, this immediately narrows the margin for error. If you take this job, you don't get to reset the quarterback room. You don't get to quietly draft your own guy and buy 2 years of grace. You inherit Shedeur, the expectations around him, the noise attached to his name, and the spotlight that follows every snap. And whether that's fair or not doesn't matter. That's the reality. What makes this even trickier is the internal contradiction it creates. Cleveland still owes Deshaun Watson a massive amount of guaranteed money. They also invested draft capital in Dillon Gabriel. That means any coach walking in is managing 3 timelines at once. The past contract they can't escape, the developmental quarterback they didn't choose, and the organizational mandate they must obey. That's not football strategy. That's political navigation. Some coaches see this and immediately tap out. Not because they doubt Shedeur's talent, but because they understand how fast narratives turn. If he struggles early, it won't be framed as development. It'll be framed as confirmation. And the coach will be the one explaining it every week while ownership and the front office quietly distance themselves. There's also the unspoken fear no one wants to admit publicly. Shedeur doesn't just come with expectations, he comes with visibility. Every decision gets questioned. Every benching becomes a headline. Every adjustment turns into a debate. For coaches who prefer control, that kind of environment feels suffocating. But here's the part that exposes the league's hypocrisy. Coaches love talking about leadership. They preach development. They say the job is about building men, not avoiding pressure. Yet when presented with a talented young quarterback and a chance to define his future, many are suddenly cautious, suddenly selective. And that's why this ultimatum matters so much. It doesn't just test belief in Shedeur Sanders, it tests belief in coaching itself. Because if developing quarterbacks is truly the most important skill in the NFL, then walking away from this challenge says more about the coaches than it does about the player. And that's where the conversation starts to get uncomfortable. On the surface, the narrative is simple. Coaches are hesitant because the Browns are dysfunctional. Bad ownership, bad contracts, bad history. That explanation is convenient and incomplete. The real reason some coaches are quietly backing away goes deeper, and it has less to do with Cleveland than people want to admit. It's about risk. In today's NFL, head coaching jobs are no longer about upside. They're about survival. Most coaches don't walk into a situation asking, "How high can this go?" They ask, "How fast can this end?" And when they look at Cleveland, they don't see a rebuild, they see a countdown clock. Shedeur Sanders accelerates that clock. Not because he's bad, but because expectations arrive immediately. If you commit to him as QB1, there's no slow rollout. There's no patience phase. Every snap becomes evidence for or against your competence. If he flashes, it's expected. If he struggles, it's magnified. And if you bench him, that's not a football decision anymore. That's a cultural moment. Coaches understand how narratives work. They know that if Shedeur succeeds, credit will be split between talent, pedigree, and circumstance. But if he fails, the blame will land squarely on coaching. That asymmetry scares people more than they'll ever admit on TV. There's also the media element that nobody wants to say out loud. Shedeur's name carries gravity, not because of who he is, but because of who surrounds him. Fair or unfair, every press conference becomes loaded. Every question feels layered. Coaches who thrive in quiet systems suddenly find themselves operating in constant daylight. That's why some candidates would rather sit out a year. They'd rather wait for a cleaner job with a quieter quarterback and fewer variables. They want control over the narrative, not just the playbook. But here's the contradiction. These same voices complain that players are too coddled, that modern athletes can't handle hard coaching, that toughness is disappearing. And yet, when the challenge flips toward them, when the pressure lands on the coach instead of the roster, hesitation appears. That's not strategy, that's fear disguised as prudence. What's rarely discussed is that this situation exposes how many coaches rely on built-in excuses. Injured quarterback, bad cap, transitional year. Shedeur removes those shields. If you say yes to this job, you're also saying yes to accountability. And that's why the refusals matter. Because the coaches walking away aren't just rejecting Cleveland. They're rejecting the idea that development is worth the risk. They're choosing comfort over challenge. And in a league that claims to value growth, that contradiction is louder than any press release. And once you see it that way, the entire coaching carousel starts to look very different. At some point, the discussion around Shedeur Sanders quietly stopped being about football. It shifted into something far more dangerous, perception. And once that happens in the NFL, truth becomes optional. Listen closely to how analysts frame him. They rarely attack his arm talent. They don't question his mobility. They don't deny the flashes he's already shown. Instead, the language changes. Words like noise, baggage, circus, and distraction start doing the heavy lifting. None of those show up on film. None of them appear on stat sheets, but they carry weight in coaching rooms. That's the trap. Shedeur is being treated as a symbol rather than a quarterback. A symbol of modern players, of nil money, of attention, of a league that older voices believe has gone soft. And once you're cast in that role, reality stops mattering as much as the story people want to tell. Here's the irony. Shedeur's actual behavior doesn't match the narrative at all. When he was named the starter, he didn't celebrate. He didn't demand security. He didn't talk about entitlement. He said he was focused on the next game. He said nothing was guaranteed. That's not arrogance. That's awareness. But awareness doesn't trend. What trends is the assumption that he needs to be handled, that he requires a hard-ass coach to straighten him out, that he must be challenged more than others. And once that assumption takes hold, it becomes self-fulfilling. Coaches convince themselves they're inheriting a problem before they ever meet the player. That's how evaluation gets poisoned. It's also how development gets delayed. Instead of asking, how do we build around his strengths? The conversation becomes, how do we control the situation? That mindset leads to conservative play calling, shorter leashes, and rushed judgments. And when those decisions backfire, the blame circles right back to the quarterback. What makes this even more frustrating is that Shedeur has already shown the one trait coaches claim to value most, resilience. He's been buried on depth charts. He's waited. He's worked. He stayed quiet while narratives formed around him. And when he finally got his opportunity, the team won. The flashes weren't imaginary. They were real. Yet somehow, the league keeps acting like belief in him is reckless. This is how talented players fall through cracks, not because they lack ability, but because they arrive wrapped in stories people are tired of hearing. And for coaches afraid of being swallowed by that noise, it's easier to say no than to rewrite the script. But the ones who do rewrite it, they change careers, they change franchises, and sometimes they change the league. And that's the part everyone seems terrified of getting wrong. When coaches quietly turn away from Cleveland, they aren't just rejecting a job, they're protecting themselves from risk. And in today's NFL, risk doesn't always come from losing games. Sometimes it comes from winning the wrong way. Behind the scenes, this coaching search isn't being framed as a fresh start. It's being framed as a test. Candidates aren't just asked if they want the Browns' job. They're being asked a much sharper question. Can you win with Shedeur Sanders as QB1? And are you willing to stand by that decision publicly? That second part is where hesitation creeps in. Because if you say yes, you're signing up for scrutiny that goes beyond X's and O's. Every interception becomes a headline. Every loss becomes a referendum. Every press conference turns into questions about day-in, media pressure, locker room dynamics, and control. Coaches know this. They've seen what happens when narratives take over seasons. So some of them are choosing the safe route, waiting for cleaner situations, veteran quarterbacks, lower noise, fewer microphones. And that's being sold as wisdom. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The NFL is never quiet. Every franchise has drama. Every quarterback comes with complications. The difference is that most of those complications are normalized. Shedeur's aren't. They're magnified. Coaches talk about wanting leaders of men, yet hesitate when leadership actually requires backbone. Because leadership isn't just yelling in meetings or being tough in practice. It's standing in front of cameras and owning decisions when the story turns hostile. That's the real fear. What makes this even more revealing is how quickly some analysts contradict themselves. They argue the Browns need a disciplinarian, someone who won't coddle players. Then, in the same breath, they talk about trading multiple first-round picks for an offensive genius who can unlock a young quarterback. Those two ideas don't clash, they expose the truth. Everyone wants development. No one wants responsibility. Developing Shedeur Sanders doesn't just require play design. It requires belief. It requires patience. It requires saying, "This is my guy," and meaning it when things get messy. That's a different level of commitment than most coaching hires demand. And that's why this situation is quietly filtering the league. Some coaches are opting out because they don't want to be tied to a project that demands courage before comfort. Others are stepping back because they know failure here wouldn't be treated like normal failure. It would be amplified. But history shows something interesting. The coaches who avoid risk rarely become legends. The ones who lean into chaos and tame it, they redefine how they're remembered. So the real question is whether Shedeur is worth the gamble. The question is whether the league still produces coaches confident enough to take it. And that answer is starting to feel uncomfortably thin. What's happening with Shedeur Sanders isn't loud or official. There's no memo, no press release, no leaked blacklist. Instead, it's the kind of reputation game the NFL has perfected over decades, quiet, informal, and incredibly powerful. This league runs on whispers. Coaches talk to other coaches. GMs trade opinions in private. Owners listen to trusted voices who frame situations long before interviews ever begin. And once a narrative settles into that ecosystem, it becomes very hard to dislodge. Not because it's true, but because it's familiar. Right now, the unspoken question floating around league circles isn't can Shedeur play? Do you really want that situation? And that is never clearly defined. It's a fog of assumptions, media attention, family visibility, expectations, pressure, all bundled together into something that sounds risky without ever being concrete. That's how reputations get shaped without evidence. If a coach turns down the Cleveland Browns job and quietly says it's because the situation is unstable, that message doesn't stay private for long. It gets repeated, softened, reframed. Soon it becomes, he didn't want to deal with Shedeur. Then it becomes, some coaches are hesitant about Shedeur. And eventually it morphs into, the league is hesitant. None of that requires Shedeur Sanders to fail. It only requires enough people to believe others are skeptical. That's the danger. Because reputation in the NFL doesn't just follow players, it follows coaches too. A coach known for avoiding tough rebuilds starts to look selective. A coach known for embracing them starts to look fearless. And when hearing cycles come around, those labels matter more than most resumes. Here where it flips. If the Browns hire a coach who openly commits to Shedeur Sanders and frames it as a challenge worth taking, that coach instantly repositions himself. He's no longer reacting to the noise. He's redefining it. But if Cleveland hesitates, stalls, or sends mixed signals, it reinforces the idea that even the organization isn't fully convinced. An organization sense that. The irony is that Shedeur has already shown he can handle uncertainty better than most. He's played through it. He's spoken calmly through it. He hasn't demanded control. He's asked for trust. Yet the league keeps projecting chaos onto him. This is how the NFL quietly decides who gets patience and who gets pressure. And the outcome of this coaching hire won't just shape the Browns. It will send a message across the league about whether perception still beats production. Because once a player proves he can survive the reputation game, the football part finally gets simple. For all the talk about coaches backing away, there's another group that isn't getting nearly enough attention. The ones watching this situation and seeing something entirely different. Not danger, not chaos, opportunity. These are the coaches who don't flinch at noise because they've lived inside it before. They understand that every franchise-changing quarterback comes wrapped in controversy at some point. They know that pressure isn't a warning sign. It's proof that something meaningful is at stake. When these coaches look at Shedeur Sanders, they don't start with headlines. They start with tape. They see arm strength that stretches defenses. They see pocket awareness that can't be taught. They see a quarterback who keeps his eyes downfield under pressure instead of panicking. And most importantly, they see someone who hasn't been broken by instability. That matters more than people admit. Because the hardest thing to coach isn't talent, it's confidence after chaos. And Shedeur hasn't lost his, even after being buried on depth charts, even after being surrounded by questions that had nothing to do with football, even after becoming a talking point instead of a player. He stayed measured, focused, grounded. That's not softness, that's composure. The right coach doesn't see Shedeur as a rebuild headache. He sees him as a multiplier, a quarterback who, if developed properly, changes how Cleveland is viewed overnight. Suddenly the Browns aren't dysfunctional, they're misunderstood. Suddenly the coach isn't reckless, he's visionary. This is how reputations flip. History is full of examples. Coaches who took on quarterbacks others doubted and built legacies from it. Not because the situation was clean, but because the upside was undeniable. Those coaches didn't wait for perfect conditions. They created them. And that's why this moment matters so much. If Cleveland hires someone who embraces Shedeur publicly and privately, it sends a signal far beyond one locker room. It tells the league that development still matters, that courage still exists, that not every decision has to be filtered through fear of optics. And if that happens, the narrative collapses fast. Because once a coach stands firmly behind Shedeur Sanders and lets him grow without panic buttons or mixed messages, the conversation shifts, the noise fades, the questions stop, the football takes over. That's the fork in the road right now. One path leads to hesitation, hedging, and short-term safety. The other leads to belief, risk, and the chance to build something that actually lasts. And the coach who chooses the second path won't just be taking a job. He'll be making a statement. When all the noise fades, this story isn't really about the Cleveland Browns. It's not even just about Shedeur Sanders. It's about what the NFL actually values when things get uncomfortable. For months, the league has talked itself in circles. Analysts debate toughness, leadership, culture, and accountability. Coaches talk about wanting to be challenged, about pushing players to be great, about building something meaningful instead of inheriting it. But now that a real test is sitting in front of them, many are blinking. Shedeur Sanders represents that test. Not because he lacks talent, but because he forces people to confront their own limits, their tolerance for pressure, their willingness to lead through noise instead of hiding from it. The easy path is to label him complicated and walk away. The harder path is to see him as a quarterback who's already survived instability and come out sharper. And that's where the league feels exposed. If coaches keep passing on Cleveland because of Shedeur, it won't say much about him. It will say everything about them. It will reveal a league full of leaders who love the idea of toughness, but only when it comes without consequences, who preach accountability, but quietly avoid situations where accountability might apply to them too. Because developing a young quarterback isn't just about schemes or playbooks. It's about standing firm when narratives turn hostile. It's about resisting the urge to panic. It's about trusting evaluation over perception. Shedeur has already shown he can handle that weight. The question is whether the NFL has coaches who can. History doesn't remember the ones who waited for perfect conditions. It remembers the ones who took imperfect situations and reshaped them. The Browns don't need a savior. They need conviction. Someone willing to say, "This is my quarterback," and live with that decision long enough to let it grow. So when this coaching search ends, don't just look at who Cleveland hires. Look at who didn't want the job. Look at who walked away. Because years from now, when Shedeur Sanders' career is fully written, this moment will be remembered less as a risk and more as a mirror. A mirror that showed who was brave enough to lead and who was.